Today at the White House, Karoline Leavitt didn't just face tough questions, she unraveled under them. What was supposed to be a routine press briefing turned into a moment where reporters calmly asked for facts, and the administration responded with deflection, accusation, and pure spin. Instead of answers, we got finger-pointing. Instead of clarity, we got outrage. And by the end of it, the contrast was obvious. The questions were measured, the responses were not, and that's why this briefing is now blowing up.
Just to follow up on the health care plan, one of the things in the Affordable Care Act was coverage of pre-existing conditions. Is there any discussion or inclusion on that issue in the president's plan?
The president's plan that he outlined today will have no impact on individuals in this country with pre-existing conditions. Obviously, that's a continued conversation that the White House will have with Congress, but that's not the president's intention with the great health care plan.
Caroline.
Go ahead.
Thanks, Caroline. Two questions on Minneapolis.
And then you. Go ahead.
Thanks. Two questions on Minneapolis, one on the ICE agent, the other on the rioting. I believe last night there were protesters or rioters that rifled through an FBI car, took weapons. We had a reporter embedded with ICE who said that she saw constant harassment all evening. Can you speak to the rhetoric we're hearing from Democrat politicians, whether they are causing violence against ICE, as well as some of the headlines we've seen not including the full story?
Yeah, I mean, to your first point, I think I've addressed that these Democrat governors and mayors in not just Minnesota, but in states across the country are essentially, they've referred to ICE agents who, again, are brave men and women. And I would encourage everyone in this room, and I would encourage Governor Walz and other Democrats who are demeaning law enforcement to sit down and have a cup of coffee with an ICE agent or a Border Patrol agent. These are great, patriotic men and women who have families, who put on the uniform every day and are following our nation's immigration laws at the direction of their bosses and again, at the direction of the law. They are simply trying to enforce the law. And the Democrat Party has demeaned these individuals. They've even referred to them as Nazis and as the Gestapo. And that is absolutely leading to the violence we're seeing in the streets. If you look at some of the images out of Minneapolis last night, look at this vehicle. Look at what it says. It says F ICE. You have these individuals who are putting their middle finger, proudly so, at the camera. Another ICE individual, a vehicle that was vandalized last night by these left-wing agitators. People don't do this without encouragement from people in power who make them feel like it's okay. Here's another one. And I'm pretty sure this car, you can't see it, said the best agent is a dead agent or something to that effect. This is despicable rhetoric that we're seeing, and the media is absolutely complicit in this violence because if you look at the headline from CNN, protests erupt after federal agent shoots man in Minneapolis, that is not the story, that is not the truth. If you actually want to know the truth, you can look at what the Department of Homeland Security released, which is that this ICE agent was executing a targeted operation against a Venezuelan illegal alien who was unlawfully present in the country. And when this ICE agent tried to detain the individual, 3 more of his comrades came rushing out of a house and started ambushing and attacking the ICE agent. They used a shovel or a broom to smash his face in. And so yes, that agent had to use self-defense and take up his weapon to protect his own life. That is what's happening on the streets of Minneapolis. That's what's happening on the streets, unfortunately, of these Democrat-run cities and states where you have elected officials who are encouraging such violence against our brave men and women in law enforcement.
Yeah. In moments of public crisis, especially those involving state violence, the language chosen by those in power matters as much as the facts themselves. Karoline Leavitt's responses to reporters' questions about an ICE officer's use of force do not merely offer an explanation of events, they perform a political act. Her remarks adopt the tone and tactics of a partisan vlogger rather than a public official entrusted with informing the public. The result is not clarity, but polarization. Not accountability, but accusation. Not democratic reassurance, but narrative intimidation. This essay argues that Leavitt's rhetoric is deeply flawed, not simply because of what it claims, but because of how it reframes power, responsibility, evidence, and dissent in ways that undermine democratic norms. At the center of Leavitt's answers is an aggressive insistence on certainty. From the outset, she presents the ICE officer's use of force as unquestionably justified, framed as an act of self-defense during a lawful operation. This framing is not offered as a provisional account pending investigation. It is delivered as settled truth. Such rhetorical finality is deeply problematic in any use of force case, particularly one that unfolds amid conflicting witness accounts, incomplete evidence, and heightened public tension. In a democratic society, the role of a government spokesperson is not to foreclose inquiry, but to acknowledge uncertainty while committing to transparency. Leavitt does the opposite. She collapses complexity into moral absolutes. This certainty is achieved through narrative compression. In Leavitt's telling, the incident becomes a simple morality play, brave federal officers enforcing the law versus violent agitators emboldened by reckless rhetoric and irresponsible media coverage. By structuring the story this way, she removes space for nuance. Questions about proportionality, escalation, training, rules of engagement, or accountability are treated not as legitimate inquiries, but as hostile insinuations. The very act of questioning is reframed as an attack on law enforcement itself. Such framing relies heavily on emotional manipulation. Leavitt repeatedly emphasizes the personal humanity of ICE agents, their families, their patriotism, their daily risks. These details are not irrelevant, but they are strategically deployed to redirect sympathy away from the harmed individual and toward the state actor wielding force. This rhetorical move is powerful precisely because it short-circuits ethical analysis. By foregrounding the officer's fear and sacrifice, Leavitt implicitly suggests that any scrutiny of the officer's actions is cruel, ungrateful, or dangerous. The moral center of the story is relocated from the act of violence to the feelings of the actor who committed it. This move is especially troubling because it erases the asymmetry of power inherent in state violence. Federal agents operate with extraordinary authority, legal immunity, institutional backing, weaponry, and the presumption of legitimacy. Civilians do not. When a spokesperson treats the state actor as the primary victim in a lethal or near-lethal encounter, the imbalance of power disappears from view. Violence becomes individualized, an unfortunate but understandable reaction, rather than a structural issue requiring oversight. Accountability is replaced with empathy for the enforcer. Leavitt's rhetoric also relies heavily on the politics of blame. Rather than confining her remarks to the facts of the incident, she expands the field of culpability to include Democratic politicians, protesters, and the media. According to this logic, violence against ICE agents is not the result of enforcement practices, policy choices, or situational dynamics. It is the inevitable consequence of demeaning rhetoric and insufficient loyalty to law enforcement. This argument is seductive because it offers a clean villain, critics themselves, yet it collapses under scrutiny. First, the claim that political criticism of ICE directly causes violence is asserted, not demonstrated. Leavitt provides no evidence of a causal chain, no proof that specific statements led to specific actions. Instead, correlation is treated as causation, and dissent is implicitly criminalized. This is a dangerous precedent. In a democracy, criticism of government agencies is not only protected, it is essential. To suggest that rhetorical opposition to ICE constitutes incitement is to place dissent itself under suspicion. Second, this framing shifts responsibility away from institutional conduct and onto public reaction. If unrest follows a controversial enforcement action, the blame is assigned not to the action, but to those who question it. This inversion of responsibility allows agencies to operate without meaningful feedback loops. Any public backlash becomes evidence not of policy failure, but of moral corruption among critics. The institution becomes insulated from accountability by portraying itself as perpetually besieged. Nowhere is this more evident than in Leavitt's attacks on the media. Her criticism of headlines and coverage is not limited to factual disputes. It is moral and accusatory. Media outlets are described as complicit in violence, as if reporting on a shooting is itself an act of provocation. This is not a defense of accuracy, it is an attempt to delegitimize independent scrutiny. By positioning official government statements as the sole source of truth, Leavitt collapses the distinction between information and propaganda. This strategy is particularly insidious because it exploits real public distrust in media while offering no alternative mechanism for verification. If reporters cannot question official narratives without being accused of endangering lives, then journalism ceases to function. Power becomes self-justifying. The state investigates itself, explains itself, and absolves itself, while critics are cast as reckless or malicious. This is not merely bad rhetoric, it is anti-democratic. Leavitt's tone reinforces this dynamic. Rather than measured, careful, or restrained, her delivery mirrors that of a political influencer, confrontational, emotive, and performative. This is not accidental. The vlogger style is designed to mobilize an audience, not inform it. It thrives on outrage, binary thinking, and moral certainty. When adopted by an official spokesperson, it transforms governance into spectacle. Press briefings become content. Accountability becomes a loyalty test. The consequences of this shift are profound. Democratic institutions rely on a shared commitment to process, investigation, evidence, proportionality, and due process. Leavitt's rhetoric undermines each of these. Investigation is preempted by certainty. Evidence is selectively invoked or dismissed. Proportionality is obscured by fear narratives. Due process is reframed as a threat to public safety. In such an environment, force is not scrutinized, it is sanctified. Equally troubling is the way Leavitt frames the geographic and political context of the incident. By emphasizing that the unrest occurred in a Democrat-run city or state, she converts a specific event into a partisan morality tale. The implication is that violence and disorder are inherent features of political opposition, not outcomes of policy tensions or social conditions. This framing deepens polarization and discourages good faith engagement. If cities governed by political rivals are depicted as inherently lawless, then federal intervention becomes not a contested policy choice, but a moral necessity. This rhetorical strategy also serves to normalize extraordinary measures. When law enforcement is portrayed as under constant existential threat, expanded powers become easier to justify. Oversight is framed as weakness. Transparency is framed as risk. In this way, Leavitt's defense of a single use-of-force incident becomes part of a broader argument for unchecked authority. The specific facts matter less than the emotional architecture constructed around them. It is important to note what is missing from Leavitt's responses. There is no acknowledgement of the gravity of using lethal force, no expression of concern for the injured or deceased beyond procedural language, no recognition that public trust depends on independent investigation, no commitment to release evidence or engage with conflicting accounts. The absence of these elements is not neutral, it signals priorities. Order over accountability, authority over legitimacy, narrative control over truth. Defenders of Leavitt might argue that her role requires defending federal agents and maintaining morale. This is a false dichotomy. One can affirm the dignity and safety of law enforcement while still acknowledging the necessity of oversight and the legitimacy of public concern. Indeed, genuine support for law enforcement requires accountability because trust is their most valuable asset. When spokespersons treat scrutiny as betrayal, they erode the very legitimacy they claim to protect. Ultimately, the most damaging aspect of Leavitt's rhetoric is not its aggressiveness, but its worldview. It imagines a society divided into enforcers and enemies, loyalty and treachery, order and chaos. In this worldview, democratic friction is pathology, not process. Disagreement is danger. Journalism is sabotage. Courts, investigators, and critics are obstacles rather than safeguards. This is the logic of power without accountability, and it is incompatible with a functioning democracy. A healthier response to the incident would have looked very different. It would have acknowledged the seriousness of the event, affirmed the value of independent investigation, refrained from assigning blame prematurely, and respected the role of the press and public inquiry. It would have spoken to citizens as adults capable of holding multiple truths at once, that law enforcement work is dangerous and that state violence must be scrutinized, that agents deserve safety, and that civilians deserve accountability. That order matters, and so does legitimacy. Karoline Leavitt chose another path. By adopting an accusatory vlogger-style tone, she transformed a moment that called for restraint into an exercise in narrative domination. In doing so, she did not strengthen public trust in law enforcement or democratic institutions. She weakened it, and in a democracy already strained by polarization and mistrust, that choice carries consequences far beyond a single press briefing. If democratic institutions are to endure, they require more than enforcement. They require humility, transparency, and respect for dissent. When power speaks only in accusations, it reveals not strength, but fear of scrutiny, fear of accountability, fear of the very public it claims to protect.